You're standing in the grand cathedral of Westminster Abbey, and before you walks a girl who can barely reach the altar without assistance. She's draped in ermine and gold, wearing a crown that weighs nearly as much as she does, and thousands of nobles bow as she passes. But here's what makes your blood run cold. This isn't a costume party or some elaborate play. This child, no older than your little sister, is about to become the most powerful person in England. And the man waiting for her at that altar? He's old enough to be her grandfather. Before we dive into these forgotten stories of power and innocence lost, if you're fascinated by the hidden truths behind royal history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these centuries-old secrets together from different corners of the world. What you're about to discover isn't just another tale of medieval customs. It's the disturbing reality of how political ambition transformed childhood into currency, how kingdoms were built on the backs of little girls who never had a choice, and how some of history's most famous queens were actually victims long before they ever held real power. The practice of child marriage among royalty wasn't an occasional tragedy. It was systematic, calculated, and considered completely normal by the people who should have protected these children most. Let's start with a name that might surprise you: Margaret Beaufort. Most people know her as the formidable mother of Henry VII, the woman who orchestrated one of the most successful political comebacks in English history. But few realize that this legendary figure was first married at the age of 6. 6 years old. Think about that for a moment. While modern 6-year-olds are learning to tie their shoes and read simple books, Margaret was already legally bound to a grown man in a ceremony that would determine the rest of her life. The year was 1443, and Margaret wasn't unique. She was simply following a pattern that had been established for centuries across every royal house in Europe. These weren't marriages in any sense we would recognize today. They were business transactions disguised as religious ceremonies, political alliances sealed with the signatures of children who couldn't even write their own names properly yet. But Margaret's story gets even more disturbing. Her first husband died when she was still a child, making her a widow before she reached double digits. Then came her second marriage at age 9 to Edmund Tudor, a man nearly 3 decades her senior. And here's where the true horror of this system becomes clear. Edmund didn't wait for Margaret to grow up. By the time she was 12, she was pregnant with the future King of England. Can you imagine the terror of a 12-year-old girl facing childbirth in the 15th century? Medieval medicine was primitive at best, and pregnancy complications killed women regularly, adult women with fully developed bodies. Margaret was still a child herself, physically and emotionally unprepared for what was happening to her. The birth was traumatic enough that she never had another child, despite being married 2 more times. Some historians believe the damage was so severe that she became physically incapable of bearing more children. Yet Margaret survived, and more than that, she thrived. But her success came at an unimaginable cost, and her story illustrates something crucial about these child brides of the crown. They weren't just passive victims. Many of them developed remarkable resilience, political acumen, and strength precisely because they had to navigate such dangerous circumstances from such a young age. They learned to read people, to manipulate situations, and to survive in environments where one wrong move could mean death or disgrace. This brings us to perhaps the most famous child bride in English history, Catherine of Aragon. Everyone knows her as Henry VIII's first wife, the woman he divorced to marry Anne Boleyn. But Catherine's story of childhood exploitation began long before she ever set foot in England. She was betrothed to Henry's older brother Arthur when she was just 3 years old, a toddler promised to a boy she'd never met, in a country she'd never seen, speaking a language she didn't know. The betrothal wasn't just a formality. From the moment that contract was signed, Catherine's entire life was reorganized around preparing her for this marriage. She was taught English, trained in English customs, and educated specifically to become the perfect English queen. Her childhood wasn't her own. It belonged to a political alliance between Spain and England that adults had crafted without consulting her opinion or considering her feelings. When Catherine finally traveled to England at age 15 to marry Arthur, she was walking into a situation that would define not just her own fate, but the entire future of English religion and politics. The marriage lasted only months before Arthur died, leaving Catherine in an impossible position. She was a teenage widow in a foreign country, valuable only for the political alliance she represented, with no real power to determine what happened next. What followed was even more disturbing than her original marriage. Henry VII, Arthur's father, couldn't afford to lose the Spanish alliance that Catherine represented. So instead of sending her home to her parents, he kept her in England for years, essentially holding her hostage while negotiating her next marriage. And who was the groom going to be? Arthur's younger brother Henry, who was still just a boy himself when these discussions began. Think about the psychological impact of this situation. Catherine spent her late teens and early 20s in limbo, knowing that her entire future depended on marrying her dead husband's little brother. She had no money of her own, no independent status, and no way to return to Spain without permission. She was completely dependent on the goodwill of people who saw her as a political asset rather than a human being. When Henry VIII finally married Catherine in 1509, she was 23 and he was 17. By the standards of their time, this was actually considered a relatively mature marriage. But Catherine had been trapped in this arrangement since she was a toddler, and Henry had been raised knowing that marrying his brother's widow was his royal duty. Neither of them had ever had a choice in the matter. The tragedy of Catherine's story isn't just what happened to her. It's how her experience was considered completely normal, even admirable, by the people around her. She was praised for her patience during those years of uncertainty, commended for her loyalty to England despite being treated terribly by English nobles, and celebrated for fulfilling her duty as a royal bride. Nobody seemed to consider that she might have preferred a different life entirely. But Catherine's story was just beginning, and what would happen to her in the coming decades would shock even a society accustomed to treating royal women as expendable assets. The systematic abuse of royal children wasn't limited to English princesses. Across the Channel in France, the situation was equally horrifying, and in some cases even worse. Let me tell you about Isabelle of Valois, whose story will make you question everything you thought you knew about medieval romance and chivalry. Isabelle was 6 years old when she was betrothed to Richard II of England. 6 years old. But here's what makes her story particularly disturbing. The negotiations for this marriage began when she was still a toddler, barely able to speak in full sentences. French and English diplomats were already discussing the intimate details of her future married life, while she was learning to walk properly. The wedding ceremony took place when Isabelle was just 6 and Richard was 29. Picture that scene for a moment. A grown man, a king with decades of political experience and military campaigns behind him, exchanging vows with a little girl who probably didn't fully understand what was happening to her. The ceremony was treated this grotesque spectacle as Aish, attended by thousands of nobles who it clearly was. But here's where celebration rather than the child abuse Isabelle's story becomes even more twisted. Richard, despite being nearly 30, apparently developed what courtiers described as genuineered her with gifts, spent hours playing affection for his child bride. He showed to consummate the marriage until she was older games with her, and reportedly refuse. By medieval standards, this was considered remarkably considerate behavior. By any reasonable moral standard, it was a grown man grooming a child while everyone around him applauded his restraint. The psychological manipulation involved in these relationships is staggering when you really examine it. These little girls were taught from infancy that their highest purpose was to serve their future husbands, to bear their children, and to advance their political interests. They were raised to believe that their own desires, dreams, and ambitions were not just unimportant, but actually selfish. The most successful royal women were those who learned to find satisfaction in their own subjugation. Isabelle's childhood was spent in this bizarre liminal space between being treated as a precious princess and a political prisoner. She had servants, tutors, and luxuries beyond imagination, but she also had no freedom to make any meaningful choices about her own life. Every aspect of her education was designed to make her a better wife to Richard, not to develop her own interests or capabilities. When Richard was deposed and murdered in 1399, Isabelle found herself in a position that perfectly illustrates the expendable nature of these royal child brides. She was 13 years old, a widow, and suddenly worthless to the new king, Henry IV, who had his own political alliances to consider. The girl who had been treated as precious cargo just months earlier was now an inconvenience to be disposed of as quickly as possible. Henry's solution was typically medieval in its callousness. He attempted to marry Isabel to his own son, the future Henry V, who was younger than she was. When Isabel refused, one of the few recorded instances of a royal child bride actually saying no, Henry considered having her forcibly married anyway. Only intervention from her birth family in France prevented what would have been an even more traumatic second marriage. But Isabel's ordeal wasn't over. After years of negotiations, she was finally allowed to return to France, where she was immediately betrothed again, this time to her cousin Charles of Orleans, who was only 10 years old when the engagement was arranged. Even in her late teens, having already survived one traumatic royal marriage, Isabel was still being treated as a political chess piece rather than a human being with her own rights and desires. The most disturbing aspect of these stories isn't just the individual suffering of girls like Margaret, Catherine, and Isabel. It's how the system was designed to perpetuate itself through generations. These child brides, if they survived their ordeals, often became the mothers and mothers-in-law who arranged similar marriages for the next generation of little girls. Trauma became tradition, passed down through royal bloodlines like genetic inheritance. Consider the case of Joan of Navarre, who was married at age 10 to John IV of Brittany, a man in his 40s. When John died, Joan found herself a widow at 26 with several children and significant political power. You might think this would make her more sympathetic to other young girls in similar situations. Instead, Joan used her influence to arrange child marriages for her own daughters, perpetuating the exact system that had robbed her of her own childhood. These stories of Margaret, Catherine, Isabel, and countless other royal children remind us that behind every glittering crown and grand palace lay systematic abuse disguised as tradition. These weren't love stories or fairy tales, they were calculated destructions of childhood designed to serve political ambitions while destroying young lives. The next time you see a historical drama romanticizing medieval royalty, remember the real cost of those crowns. Little girls who never got to be children, whose suffering built the very kingdoms we still study today.